Already, we are recording.
Excellent. So we were doing sorry, Locke's second treatise of civil government, and we have been doing we're doing this in two parts. So we discussed chapters 1 through 10 last week, and
Hmm.
we are on 11 through 19
Hmm.
this week. Um, so what did you make of this chapter or this section?
Um, well, I had some, uh, what's the right word? Not flashbacks. It felt very familiar,
Yeah,
because I feel like we, in my knowledge of our government in the
sure.
United States, it's like, wow, okay, this is basically a one-to-one parallel, I feel like.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, So yeah, there were
I
a lot of
read,
vibes and things that it's just like, well, okay, this just looks like the United States Constitution.
yes, exactly. Which, by the way, we'll see next week.
Yeah.
I should note, um, the for next week's reading, we've got the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were actually penned first. So,
Okay.
in the order of reading, you want to read that first, and then the Declaration of Independence. I don't have a link for the Declaration of Independence, but guess what? I know you can find it.
Yep.
Um, but the link I do have is for the articles. So you're absolutely right. This is a great read to have right before the turn to American documents.
Yeah. And
Um,
what's the timeline between this and that?
we are so he's what were his dates again? His dates are oh gosh, 1632 to 1704.
Okay.
So 1776 is going to be the Declaration of Independence. Articles of Confederation, I think, are just shortly before that.
Okay.
Um, and by shortly, that might be months or year.
Hmm.
Um, So, so yeah, this is sort of like very, very connected. In my reading, Locke's actually considered as sort of like a an honorary founding father.
Interesting.
So the the and we'll get into this more, and I'll probably just do a little bit of background research, a little bit more on the founding fathers,
Hmm.
um, to see to what degree they actually were sort of like including him or reading up on him. But it seems like they certainly did, um, from what we're reading.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, no, I felt the same way. I mean, you basically have the one branch that he doesn't really discuss that we have is the judicial, the Supreme Court.
Right. I mean, his
um,
federative branch kind of sounded like that.
yeah, we're gonna have to sort of tease that out because
Yeah.
I had a little bit of confusion about the federative. Uh,
Well, there's
well,
like one
the
paragraph
fed.
in it, so.
Yeah, exactly. The federative and its connection to the executive, and
Hmm.
also the executive. While the three, well, whatever. Let's say he has a tripartite of sort, right?
Yeah.
So the legislative, executive, and federative. The the way he talks about them, even though so whatever he has a tripartite, we have a tripartite, but at the same point, they don't function in the same way,
Right.
you know.
Hmm.
Um, and that's fine. I mean, obviously, the founding fathers innovated on that element, but I would certainly say that the probably the genius is in the notion of the separation of powers.
Hmm.
Um, I think that's you know, in so having that separation of powers, you are creating this check and balance that you don't have with the monarch,
Yeah.
where all the powers are enfolded into one person, right? So I feel like the genius of both sides is that notion of separating the powers. How the powers function um, is is somewhat different,
Hmm.
right? And because the especially when he was talking about the executive, it almost seemed like the executive's function was to sort of um, put in motion or support the legislative, you know,
Yeah.
and as opposed to well, and then also, I mean, the executive does speak up where the laws are silent. I know that that came up a couple of times. right? So where
Yeah.
the legislative branches come up with all these laws, and let's say certain issues come up, um, and you need to address them, but the laws don't fully address them, then the executive has a function to play.
Right.
Um,
Well, I think one thing that's similar is it says, this is in section 144 of chapter 12,
mhm, mhm,
uh, which should therefore it is necessary there should be a power to always in being which should see to the execution of the laws that are made and remain in force. So, I
mhm.
mean, that aspect seems very much similar to our executive branch. It's like keeping the laws that are made in force and in being.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It almost like he kept on using this language of in being,
Hmm.
right? And it sort of it made me, or at least the image that came to mind was this notion that there's a set of laws. I mean, obviously, the legislative branch is made up of citizens that are making the laws, but but after those laws are made, it's almost as if they are somewhat. I mean, they're compelling, but they're sort of a static body of laws.
Yeah.
But the executive is there to sort of like, I don't know, keep them in motion, or um, maybe almost like make them realized, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, uh, because it almost seemed like I don't know if I have this down, but as I recall it, it almost seems that leg sometimes the legislative is not in being, or is not sort of like whatever active, as it were, and you need to have someone in place still to do the enforcing, if I'm being clear.
Hmm. I think that's right.
Um, yeah. So the no, I thought it was like the way that I think about the executive branch is much more like, at least within the United States, is this it's where the buck stops in the legislative process, right? So we'll read this when we read the Constitution, but the House will introduce a bill, that bill passes, it goes to the Senate. If it passes, then it ultimately goes up to the president, and the president signs it, and it becomes a law, right?
Hmm.
Whereas that notion, I don't think is not present.
Right. There's not
Um,
like
you know,
passing around the power for the
sure,
lawmaking process. It's like the
yeah,
legislative is the lawmaking process. The
exactly.
executive,
Period.
period. The executive is upholding those laws, period.
Hmm.
Um, and then the federative is a bit more confusing, but seems
Yeah,
to deal
federative. Yeah,
it seems
go.
to deal with um, interactions between the people, which is similar to the judiciary. Like it's
Yeah.
civil, like the civil aspect of upholding law, as opposed to like the relationship between the government and the people. It's like the people and the people.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. What I got from the federative too is that it's mainly dealing with issues of war. I mean, I might be wrong here, but 146, section 146.
Hmm.
This therefore contains the power of war and peace, leagues and alliances. That sounds almost international. And the transactions with all, well, now this sounds a little bit more national, with all persons and communities without the Commonwealth, may be called the federative.
Mm.
It almost seems like the sort of the international function of right. These are persons and communities without. I'm guessing that's language for outside the
Oh yeah.
Commonwealth. It
Okay.
may be called federative if one pleases. Um, and so
That
that
makes sense.
section,
Yeah.
yeah, that section to me really had the notion of sort of the international function, because obviously the Commonwealth is going to need to engage with other Commonwealths. Let's say, for instance, like let's say in peacetime with trade, um, possibly even like loans, from a larger
Hmm.
country to a smaller country, and then in war, right? And that needs to, and therefore there needs to be someone there that's actually fulfilling that function. And also, too, it seemed like the federative and the executive, their work is more ad hoc as things arise, right?
Right.
As opposed to the legislative, which is, all of these particular laws, these laws are in place. It may take a while for them to deliberate the laws and then enforce them. But once they're there, they're there. However, ad hoc in the sense that new things come up. You get attacked, and the legislative can't like go through this process of determining what to do. You need to have someone that can sort of act on it quickly. It was my notion of sort of the executive and the federative.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, um, so yeah. One thing I did think was really interesting though is that at least, and we'll see this as we read the Constitution, but at least my understanding of our government is that all three branches are sort of on an equal plane. I mean, the executive's tricky because the executive has the power of the veto, right?
Hmm.
I mean, they all have the power of the veto at various levels,
Yeah,
but he can not accept what the House and the Senate has given him as a law. So um, I still want to say, but there are checks on the executive, right? The executive, um, other, uh, well, we'll talk about this when we talk about prerogatives, but the my sense is that they're all pretty much equal.
are we
Uh,
talking about Locke's or in ours? Or both?
Power,
Okay,
no, ours in
right.
power, and um, so, but what's interesting is that within Locke, that's not the case.
Yeah.
Within Locke, the legislative is supreme, right?
Yes,
Has primacy. And I thought that was like an interesting sort of distinction between ours and Locke's.
definitely.
Um, and I'm curious as to the rationale, you know, because I'm not sure if it's sort of like he states it,
I mean,
but I'm wondering what the rationale is for that, right?
mhm. I mean, I feel like uh, by stating that the legislative is supreme, then you're saying that all of the laws are, are final in
Yeah,
what they constitute. And the legislative branch is made of the people, so the people are
yeah,
determining the laws in that sense.
yeah,
Um, Also, I mean, again, when we get to prerogative and some of these other topics, it can be overwritten or overthrown by the people should they deem it not good for the people, right?
hmm
Which is an interesting checks and balances that it's like, oh, well, it's the supreme, but if it's not acting in the way that the
right,
people that is best for the people, then it can be overthrown and taken down, um, and redone. Which is also
yeah,
interesting because in chapter 11, it talks about the legislative power not having the power to transfer its rights
yeah,
and power.
correct,
So in this sense, it's like it cannot change its own rights, but the people who make up the Commonwealth can overthrow it should it not benefit them or serve
support,
them. Yeah.
right, support the right preservation of life and property.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense also too in terms of the contract itself. So,
Yeah.
in so evolving from a state of nature into a constitution or a commonwealth, uh, we're giving up these these sort of like raw powers of a state of nature that each individual has, and you're giving it over to, well, what are you giving it over to, right? You're giving it, it needs to be transferred to something, and he's not going to do a monarch, right? Seemingly,
Yeah.
unless that monarch has a parliament or something.
So yeah, no,
But
I think.
but it's got to be given over. You've got to transfer those funds somewhere, and it makes sense that the funds would be within the body of the laws, because the laws are doing what? They're actually enforcing what you couldn't enforce in a state of nature,
Mhm.
or I'm sorry, what would be inconvenient to enforce in a state of nature,
Yeah.
right? So it would make sense that the legislative, you know, I mean, even as he talks about it, the executive and the federative really are just sort of like supports for the legislative,
Hmm.
which sort of reiterates this notion of You're not giving your power. I mean, not necessarily like giving your power to the executive, giving your power individually to the federative. You're giving it to the legislative because these are the set of laws that will preserve your property.
Yeah, and the laws
You know, do
likely
you know?
bind the other two branches, right? Like there are probably
Yeah,
laws for the executive and federative. So when you're
totally.
prescribing to the laws, you know what those branches are going to be doing for you.
Exactly. Exactly.
I also think I don't remember exactly where it was, but I'm pretty sure Locke um, does not like absolute monarchies.
Right. Right.
In fact, I think in chapter 19 he said that they're like not even considered a government.
Right.
Um, but he seems to be in support of like a monarch with parliament where there
Yes,
are
I
those
could
checks
see
and
that.
balances.
Yeah, the absolute. I think the abs like this is going to be a huge contrast to Hobbes, right? I mean,
Hmm.
the idea of an absolute monarch is just. I mean, you don't have the checks and balances. He's totally against just as the language he uses an arbitrary will, um, and you can't in the limited form of government that he's encouraging. There's no room for arbitrary will. You know,
Yeah.
so I think the yeah the notion of just a pure monarchy without another body to hold it into check is out, you know,
Hmm.
for uh for Locke. So yeah, I think the um yeah, I mean there's language about, the executive is not superior to the legislative. That's in 156. Um uh and then in 158, that's where, and I think this is going to start the prerogative section. That's where we get the language of not just see the executive is not just um the word he uses is convoking, right? Not just bringing the legislative into not existence, but into assembly and things like that. It's like someone calling forth, right?
Hmm.
I guess that's what convoke means. But someone calling forth um, the legislative body to do their work, because that was the part that kept on coming up, and it was just sort of interesting because it's like, wait a minute, the senators can walk into the Capitol without a problem and do their things, but he was sort of really about the executive sort of setting up seemingly times and places for the legislative branch to do their work.
Hmm.
But in 158, beyond this sort of, I guess, like administrative function of calling them forth, um, he does speak to this notion of is it 158? Well, it's somewhere in 158, but this idea of the executive also has more of a function than just this administrative one, but can actually create law where the law is silent.
Hmm.
I have it noted as 158, but I'm not seeing it there. Um, and that becomes interesting. Is that, let's see, that becomes interesting because then the question is what's keeping the executive um, from veering off of the fundamental contract, right?
Right.
If he's got some room to create law above or not above, but in addition to the legislative branch, what what's holding him in check? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I kind of remember what you're talking about. I don't remember where it was,
Yeah,
but I felt like the
he
vibe there was um, that where the law ends, the executive has power, and I felt like that was not a good thing.
right,
Um, like you don't want to have that kind of gap. I don't
right.
remember.
I have it marked as 158, but I don't have it underlined. Um, I mean, he doesn't introduce prerogative at the end of 158 as a transition into the next chapter on
Hmm.
prerogatives. Um,
So the convoking and dissolving is in 156 at the end of.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I don't know.
Well, we get it in. Well, yeah. Well, we whatever. We can turn to the prerogative chapter, right? Oh, okay. Well, here we go. 160. 160 has it toward the end, so on top of one page 82.
Mm-hmm.
Um, let's see, a good place to start here. Therefore, there is a latitude left to the executive power to do many things of choice which the laws do not prescribe. Okay. And he actually, a little bit above that, he talks about um, sort of accidents and necessities that may concern the public. So, and also things not foreseen in the laws, right?
Right.
Um, so the check, so basically, there is this pocket, there's room for the executive to create law that the legislative branch hasn't created. And this reminds me of what is usually done by presidents when they are inaugurated, right? They spend like the first day doing all these, executive directives,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, and whatever, Trump overturned a lot of Obama's. Biden has overturned a lot of Trump's, right?
Yep.
But what's interesting about those directives, if I'm using the right word, there's another name
Orders.
for it, but
But yeah.
yeah, is that they're, and you'd have to actually sort of.
Oh, are you there? Hello? Can you hear me? Is it my audio? Testing. Oh, my
So,
speakers.
sorry about that. I
Oh,
don't know
okay.
what happened. I don't know how much you got that. How much of that you got?
I don't think I got any of it. I don't know what happened.
Oh, okay. So, are you
Was
there?
that your end or my end?
Okay. So I was basically saying that um so the one president can enact these directives, but I feel like when they enact them, they're of a different order or different type or kind than laws that have gone through the whole legislative process,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
right? Because it's so easy to do that just with the swipe of a pen, that the one president can change the directives of another president, um, and that it takes a lot more work for the laws to go through the House, the Senate, that whole process, and then it's on the books. It's sort of I want to say it's sort of permanent until you go back through that process.
Sure.
So it reminded me that the prerogatives reminded me of that function, um, of presidents being able to sort of um, sidestep the legislative process of Congress.
Yeah, I think that's generally true.
Yeah,
Um,
but
who
but I've
was?
Yeah.
So, I mean, right. So the people are the one deciding whether or not the prerogative is the good or hurt of them.
Hmm.
So
Oh, executive
that's kind of
orders.
a
Sorry.
difference. What?
Executive orders. That's the actual term.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Executive
I said
orders.
that. I
Yeah.
don't know if you had gotten that.
Sorry, missed
It's
it.
okay.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess what that would be kind of one difference. Like, does the people have the power to overturn an executive order?
Hmm.
Um, if they don't
I,
think it's good, how does that work?
I,
But
that's exactly, and that's the, um, yeah, that's gonna maybe sort of be like an open question about it, right? Um, I mean, I'm just doing a little research here. Presidential directive or executive action is a written or oral instruction or declaration issued by the President of the United States, which may draw upon the powers vested in the President by the Constitution, statutory law, or in certain cases, congressional and judicial acquiescence. Um, they remain in effect until they're revoked, which the president could do himself or the next president, right?
mhm.
Um, so it's sort of odd because it's not going through.
Well, are there checks
Uh,
and balances? Can the legislative or judicial branches deem the executive
from what I'm
order?
looking at, yes, they can be. Presidential directives may be challenged in court or through congressional action.
Hmm.
Um, so, but it says direct repeal by Congress is quite rare in modern times because it may be necessary to override a presidential veto, which requires an exclusive two-thirds supermajority in both chambers. So it's hard to do. Um, but what's interesting is that, yeah, yeah, I don't know. I feel like when we get into the Constitution, we're going to have to analyze that one a little bit more,
Yeah.
you know?
Hmm.
Um, but it seems that in this section on prerogatives, um, I mean, one, it makes sense, right? So the law, the body of laws will not always speak to new and pressing circumstances. So it is good to have someone in place to speak to them. And in cases of war, wars may be a really good example, right? Because it's immediate, there's an attack. You cannot go through both branches because of the pace, the slow pace. So if we need to act, we need to act quickly. And as sort of commander in chief or federative,
Hmm.
you can do so. So that that might be sort of a good one to sort of like hold on to. The other ones we'd have to tease out later, where it's maybe not as pressing, you know.
Right.
Um, and he defines it in 165. He says prerogative is nothing but the power of doing public good, but without a rule, which
Yeah.
I am implying like a law that's in place, right? Um, so the question, though, you'd ask is, what are the limits of it? You know, that
Yeah.
seems to be that seems to be like uh, not only what are the limits of it, but also if if the executive goes beyond that limit, what kind of recourse does one have?
Right.
You know,
Um,
so I get the logic of why it's allowed. Um, I mean, even in 165, prerogative can be nothing but the people's permitting their rulers to do several things of their own free choice, where the law was silent, and sometimes, two, this is interesting, against the direct letter of the law for
mm,
the public good. But you're doing it for the public good. That's the final notion. Um,
yeah. At the end of 166, prerogative is
mhm,
nothing but the power of doing public good without a rule.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But
So it seems, yeah, I mean,
so
it
I mean that's
seems,
limited
yeah.
to public good. In 166, it for the good of the people was a right in them to do. For the harm of the people, if they so pleased, it has often occasioned contest, and
Hmm.
sometimes public disorders, before the people could recover their original right. So
Hmm.
it's kind of like prompting the people to respond if it is not for their good,
Hmm.
right? With
Yeah.
contesting it or public disorders. So I guess
Yeah. So let's go to war. So war, I mean, let's say that, we're attacked, or a smaller country is attacked that we're allies with, right? So it seems like the executive would have the prerogative to
or the
respond.
federative,
Yeah, sorry, yes, the federative would have the ability to respond, um, and that would be, let's say, for the public good, because whatever, we need to mete out justice, right? So if we've been attacked, um, uh, if it's a just war, and we have good reasons for it, then in the end, that would be for the public good. You know,
right?
it's tricky though. I mean, if we actually looked at like specific directives, right? Um, uh, uh, then we'd have to look at specific directives to see, or executive orders to see, like, are those in the public good? Obviously, the president that enacts them would say so.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I don't know. I think that there's this is like, in other words, it seems like what Locke is saying is a lot of things that make sense to, let's say, a rational executive, right? And
Hmm.
one that is playing by the rules of civil society and the fundamental contract. But if you have someone in there that's not, what's that check is, I'm not finding it, you know, like
Oh, between the people
what
and the ruler.
yeah, if you, in other words, because remember, he even says, right, which I just read, sometimes too against the direct letter of the law, but for the public good. So, so in other words, like, it, he might be doing something that goes against the letter of the law, uh, and right there, you might say, wait a minute, you know, the people should protest because this is the legislative, this is the
Hmm.
supreme body. Um, but he's doing it for, but he's doing it for the public good. And the problem is, I think we're not finding the right example to sort of chew on, because a just war makes sense. He moves on it. The legislative is not a part of it, and it's for the public good. Let's say it's for, some national security element. Um, but so we'd have to find the problem areas, and I don't know enough of the history of executive orders to find a problem area.
Right.
You with me? To
Yeah.
sort of be like, no, that is not for the public good. Like, we can almost definitively say that's not for the public good. And in that case, what does one do?
Right.
Right.
And I
I
think
mean, possibly you could look at certain wars that are questionable, but sometimes, and we'll find this when we read the Constitution, sometimes the act of war does go through the Congress.
hmm
So if there's sort of a period of time where, um, whatever, there is a period of time to respond and assemble, both houses of Congress, and for them to deliberate and vote, then it actually sometimes can go through that process, as opposed to the executive just, starting it. So I was thinking, like, for instance, like Vietnam's a big sort of like question mark in terms of whether or not it was really smart for us to be part of that war, right? And whatever, a lot of loss of life. That's not necessarily for the public good. It's not a pressing war on our country per se, right? Because it's in Vietnam. And obviously, depending on what, interpretation or what political commitments you have, you're going to have different interpretations as to whether or not we should have been there, right? But also, too, I don't know with that example whether or not that was an executive decision or if that went through Congress,
Mm.
Because if it goes through Congress, then you don't really have a problem, right? Because you played the Lockean argument. Hey, it has the legislative, it's supreme, and they voted that we should go to war.
Right.
Um, but if it's the cases of the executive doing an overreach, and it's not for the public good, what does Locke say we do?
Right.
You know?
And I think 168 kind of addresses this. It might not be the
Hmm.
answer we want, but it's basically asking who shall judge that power.
Yeah,
And it says
that's an
cases
interesting
where they have
section.
no judge on earth but appeal to heaven. Um, yeah, it's interesting. Like it's talking about like going to heavenly powers to
Hmm.
figure out what is considered right or wrong in that moment.
Yeah,
Um, which I
but
mean,
I
take
but
it as you
that's
will.
vague to me.
Yeah, it is.
Okay,
Um,
right.
so I think in this sense, it's like the majority. Here we go.
Hmm.
The bottom of 168. Nor let anyone think this lays a perpetual foundation for disorder, for this operates not till the inconveniency is so great that the majority feel it, and are
Hmm.
weary of it, and find a necessity to have it amended. So it seems like the majority is ruling here if it is inconveniencing them.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would probably say if so in our case with the United States, um, two ways to remove an executive. Well, three. The third one's illegal. Um, that would be like a coup or an assassination.
Right.
But two ways would be you wait till the next cycle and vote him out,
Yep.
or you wait till the end of a two-term president if it happens in the second term and he's got to exit anyway, or you impeach.
Or you go through legislative means to just
Re,
undo that executive
that's true.
order.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Um, so I would say that would be our form of recourse.
Yeah.
Um, but but yeah, I feel like Locke is not precisely clear about what to do. I mean, other than the bit that you felt, or you had on the majority, that I guess there is a way to sort of oust him or correct the directive or prerogative
Yeah.
with some type of majority vote or something like that. Um, yeah, yeah,
Something that's interesting. This kind of skips 15, but we can come
yeah.
back. Um, there's an interesting pattern in chapters 16, 17, and 18,
Hmm.
where they're all talking about something unlawful in a different aspect. So
Hmm.
16 is kind of talking about unlawful, so it's talking about conquest, so like the
Right,
unlawful kind of gaining possession of another commonwealth or another
right.
people. Chapter 17 is talking about this like unlawful possession of another person's property within uh,
Hmm.
the Commonwealth, and then
Right.
18 is talking about the king's power over the people, so unlawful
Hmm.
possession of the Commonwealth,
Right.
so tyranny.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting. It's like a different state of war between different entities in
Yes.
these three chapters.
Yes. No, I can see that. I can see that. And it's interesting too that um it seems like I feel like this is a little bit of a commentary. Well, even if Locke didn't intend it, a little bit of a commentary on a Machiavellian theory and a Hobbesian theory, right? Um, because I
Hmm.
feel like Machiavelli would not have a problem with conquest, would not have a problem maybe with usurpation if he was able to do it on the sly, right?
Right.
So in other words, he was able to still maintain the respect of the populace, right? Because that's key with Machiavelli.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, Hobbes clearly of tyranny, right? I mean, I say that because I feel like Hobbes, because he's for an absolute monarch,
Yeah,
one
that's fair.
I feel like he doesn't really protect against tyranny. Um, yeah, no, I thought there was this really interesting. Well, it was short, but in the tyranny section, um, I I couldn't help but read Thrasymachus into it. It was in on page 100 at the bottom of section 200. Um, he says that thus the learned king who well understood the notions of things makes the difference betwixt a king and a tyrant to consist only in this, that one makes the laws the bounds of his power and the good of the public, the end of his government, and the other makes all give way to his will and appetite. It was especially appetite that sort of like struck me in terms of the appetitive function that Plato or Socrates details in the three parts of the soul, right?
Hmm.
The rational, the appetitive, or sorry, the rational, the spirited, the appetitive, or the desiring part, and the disordered soul is run by the appetite, which ultimately then would be a commentary on Thrasymachus, right? It wouldn't be good to be that kind of individual, nor would it be good to have that kind of regime that's driven not by reason, but by raw desire.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I mean this is
Oh, also, this is
yeah,
interesting. In 202,
yeah,
wherever law ends, tyranny begins.
yeah, mm-hmm,
The law be transgressed to another's harm. Like that kind of sounds similar to what we were just talking about with prerogatives. It's like, well, where the
mm-hmm,
law ends,
yep,
the executive has power, so I guess be careful not to be, tyrannic.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm, yeah, exactly. And again, like the wise prince would know this, or the wise executive would know this, right?
Hmm.
And wouldn't overstep that bound. Um,
Or the
but not so
philosopher
much,
king, perhaps.
yeah, right, right. But not so much, you know, the executive that has tyrannical tendencies,
Hmm.
as it were. Um, yeah, what did you get from these sections? I mean, I felt like a lot of them were somewhat intuitive,
Yeah.
um, and not too problematic. Um,
Yeah, I agree. I think they kind of repeat some of the things from maybe the earlier chapters
mhm,
and just solidify them in their kind of contexts.
right, right.
Um,
I mean, it seems like it really does make an interesting because I mean, he's English, and so it makes you think about like uh, the British Empire, which was a colonizing empire, right?
hmm.
Um, so certainly at the time of this writing, colonizing is still going on in the British Empire, but especially the conquering part seems to be a bit of a commentary on an imperializing tendency, you know.
Hmm.
Um, in other words, he doesn't seem to be in favor of unless I'm wrong, of just sort of like conquest for the sake of conquest, right?
Right.
It's a type of stealing, as it were, and I mean, I know he does talk about sort of the notion of combatants versus non-combatants in a war, that
Yes.
the non-combatants aren't held. Um, you can't hold them accountable because they're not involved in the war, right?
Hmm.
So whatever, women and children and other men that didn't participate in it. Um, but I mean, I don't know actually. Now that I'm thinking about it, like whether or not, or maybe I should pose it as a question, like to what extent what's the purpose of conquest? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because it seems like, um, I mean, if I have my Commonwealth and my Commonwealth is based on a contract and it's all going smoothly, and you have a Commonwealth over there and it's the same thing based on a contract, it's going smoothly. What, why ever should I take over your Commonwealth?
Right.
Right? I mean,
So,
he deals with some of those details of how like the specifics would play out,
mhm,
right? But what should there ever be like, should we imperialize? Should we or colonize? You know,
right.
um, that
Oh, did you cut out again?
no, sorry, I just mid thought there.
Okay.
Um,
So, I mean, I think if we go back to the Philosopher King,
yeah,
um, he had an argument, Plato had an argument for the expansion of the government, right?
right.
Um, because it's supporting the people of that, under that rule,
Hmm.
and they're going to grow to a point where they're going to need more land, more, more resources. And it sounded like conquest was one of those ways to
Yeah,
acquire that. I don't see the specifics as to why. Like I see,
right.
mentions as to like what's okay in conquest and like what is considered unjust conquest, but
Yeah.
it's harder to
The
find
language he
examples.
seems to use is that conquest that results from it's like conquest that results from a just war versus conquest that results from an unjust war.
Yeah.
So you're going to have more problems in an unjust war, right? But but still, like, I mean, let's say that let's say that we're attacked, so something like 9/11 or something like that, we're attacked. Okay, fine. The seemingly the appropriate response would be to root out, and this is not Lockean, this is just my own thinking, is to root out the cause of that attack
Mm.
and to deal justly with them. Now,
Yeah.
if it turned to us not, so whatever, yeah, a lot, sorry, God, the Taliban. So the Taliban was like a lot of their groups were within Afghanistan, so that ended up being our focus, right? So the just response, root them out, and then mete out justice, whatever that is. But if you go, it seems like it's an overreach in that context as you're rooting them out, and obviously this didn't happen for us then to take over Afghanistan, you
Hmm.
and plant an American flag on it. Um, that seems beyond uh, yeah, beyond what the response calls for. And I'd like to think that, well, not like to think, but I think it's safe to say that most imperializing intentions in world history were nothing even near just. It was literally like, I want that land and I
Yeah.
want to colonize it and I want to incorporate it. There's no sense, sort of like Rome just continues to grow and grow and grow into this massive empire, and we're taking or whatever, Romans are taking native lands and including them into the empire. As much as I love studying Rome,
Hmm.
that's not just, right?
Yeah.
That's someone else's property, and seemingly, if you will, to use Lockean language, their commonwealth and their set of laws that are being, destroyed and usurped, as it were. You
Yeah.
um, so, but so the it it'd be interesting to think about: is there ever a case where responding, so you're in the context of a just war, it makes sense logically to take over someone else's land, and then we deal with these sort of lock-in issues of um, the specifics of his theory of what is right within conquest.
Yeah. So I just have some thoughts. I mean, one, it's not just the Romans. We got the Greeks. We got a
Oh
bunch. It's
God,
everyone, right?
yeah,
It's
yeah.
so
United
stupid.
States in many ways, right?
Yeah, in some ways, yeah. But I think I wonder. So I'm trying to figure out the distinction between an unlawful or whatever, just versus unjust war,
Yeah.
and I think so yeah, it's like an unjust one seems to be when you're overreaching and taking something that someone else's without
Hmm.
like a good reason, for example. I wonder if something more like something like the Civil War
Right.
or kind of the independence were examples of just wars,
Hmm.
because it's kind of like there's a dispute and you're fighting for the resolution of the dispute, as opposed to I'm taking over you or I'm responding to you trying to take over me.
Hmm.
So I wonder if that's like an example of a just war.
Yeah. I know that Aquinas gets some credit. I mean, I think there are other thinkers before Aquinas, but he does actually develop a just war theory. And one of the features is that you have to have a just cause. So if you don't have a just cause, um, you yeah, that falls out of the category, and therefore it becomes unjust. So a
Hmm.
just cause would be sort of responding in kind, okay, um, for Aquinas. So in other words, you can always sort of take these examples down to something sort of basic. He stole my lunch money. What is the just thing to do is to recuperate that, and
Hmm.
therefore there's a balance. The balance has been restored, as it were. So if you're attacked, um, you would have just cause to respond, right?
Yes, no, I think
Um,
that's true regardless. Like if it's
right,
unjust against you, you have cause to respond.
exactly. And also, too, you can play this out internationally. So if you do have, so the United States was not first involved in the Second World War, as both the Nazis and the Russians were trying to imperialize um, across Europe. Um, we weren't a part of it. It was out of, it's all happening over there, not here. But then we became a part of it, right?
Hmm.
So even being an ally, right? You can look across the Atlantic and be like, oh my goodness, this is not just. We have resources that we're not using, and we can be involved with this. So you can do this internationally as well in terms of an alliance.
Sure.
Um, Another element is this is sort of an interesting one is that you have to have a competent authority. So in other words, you have to have part of the theory is that you have to have an authority that is a recognized authority to announce the war. So this cannot just sort of be like um, anyone wanting to engage in it.
Hmm.
Um, I'm guessing this probably stems from the idea that if a wrong's been done to X, that it's the right person that is responding to it, right? Um, so that's an interesting feature. Um, and then this is sort of an interesting one. Oh, right intention. That's actually a really good one because right intention is not the overreach, right? It's basically like you are only engaging in the war for as an appropriate response. So if you've been attacked, to the attack. So you're not engaging in the war for irrelevant, extraneous reasons.
Right. Okay.
Um, Probability of success is another one. That's an interesting one. So it's sort of like
Oh,
if you're a small country, and you can't actually win, you probably shouldn't engage in it.
interesting. Is this still from the Aquinas?
This is all Aquinas, yeah.
Okay.
Um, Last resort is another one. So in other words, force is last. You should try to find peaceful means prior to that, and then you use force as a last resort. And then finally, it's proportionality. So that um, you basically the let's put it this way: you're not dropping atom bombs. Okay, so I mean, if you don't need to, that you're using the appropriate force against the attacker.
Right.
So those are, you know, I mean, obviously each one of these can be sort of teased out and rethought, but that's I would say that those are ones to sort of help us think about what a just war might look like, and I think some of those things do make sense, especially your intention, an appropriate response. You're not, you know, whatever. We're rooting out the Taliban, but we're not. It would be too much if we took over their country. That's not what's asked for in that moment.
Right.
Um, so yeah, colonizing is a tricky one, and I'm not really sure where, because it seems like in the conquest section, Locke might be a little bit open to it if it's a just
Yeah.
war.
Yeah.
If it's a just war, you know, you might be able to find a rationale for colonizing. Um, so I know we went down that rabbit hole um, for a bit. Did you have anything on the last section?
Yeah. That one was interesting.
Yeah.
So the title was Disillusion of Government.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I mean, it was kind of talking about like societies can exist without government,
Mm-hmm.
but they are subject to unlawful conquest against them, and they're not going to have many repercussions against that. So
Mm-hmm.
commonwealths act as a good protection to resist against those external forces. So it's kind of like an argument for commonwealths again, but also stating that societies can exist without them.
Right.
Um, I think he also talked about talked against absolute monarchies in this
Mm-hmm.
section,
Mm-hmm.
and brought forth the importance of how people are the most important members of government.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's what I got from that one. Let's see, I'm trying to see.
Just 1 second. Sorry.
Yep.
Uh, Hello?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it seemed like the essence was like it can be, it can be dissolved. And there are good reasons at times to dissolve it,
Yeah.
This, by the way, this really reminded me, and it's a nice segue given what we're reading next week, to like the rationale, to a degree, of the American Revolution. I mean, they weren't dissolving their government per se, right? They were rebelling against it or acting against it, in creating a new regime,
Right.
right? But no, it certainly, I don't know, it certainly sort of like some of the language sort of reminded me of possibly what the thinking might have been, um, when the American Revolution was happening.
Right. Endeavor to grasp, forfeit the power.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, exactly. The
Breach of
legislative
trust.
acts, legislative acts against the trust, right?
Hmm.
Stuff like that. Legislators endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people. I mean, I know religion was one key element, right?
Hmm.
The freedom to practice their religion. I'd like to say maybe one can sort of include that under a type of property, right? Ownership, because property we discussed last week was really about not just things, but also the person, right?
Yeah.
And if in my person I want to practice this religion, well, then I should be able to.
Hmm.
Um, so, yeah, it must. I'm gonna have to do a little digging before our next session, in addition to reading the documents, to see to what extent um, Locke was read, by by those, during the American Revolution.
Yeah.
Just like almost as sort of like a war cry, or or like um, I don't know, sort of like a wise sage that was giving them encouragement,
Hmm.
his words to actually um, go through with this, because it smacks so much of, um, at least what we know, not having read those documents, at least what we know about our history, and the rationale for setting up a new country, a new Commonwealth.
Yeah.
Of course, we're going to have to deal with the fact that there were natives here, so that's
Yeah.
going to be another issue, which is fine,
Yeah. I
that,
wonder.
but we'll have to face it, to
Yeah.
be fair.
No, definitely. I wonder. Was this book something that they read in their schooling?
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
it
I
would have
mean,
been around by then. And also,
it's
I'm not very
yeah,
familiar with what the English and European rule was like at that time. So maybe it would be good
yeah.
to be more
Nor do
familiar with
I.
that.
I've got a sense. My basic sense is monarch and parliament.
Hmm.
But I can't speak to it specifically, with any certainty.
Right.
But that's my sense. And then, but also then there's the question of, if there was a parliament, how strong was it up against the king?
Right. Yes.
Um, because that, in Locke's view, that would not be good, right? If the monarch or the executive or federative was too strong.
Hmm.
Um, but it's, in conclusion, I really liked it. I really liked the reading.
Yeah.
It's a great setup for what we're about to transition into, um, and it's really cool to, given all that we've read, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Machiavelli, Hobbes, to see sort of the genealogy of power, as it were,
Hmm.
and different theories devoted to it. Um, and the similarities and differences between Hobbes and Locke, right? Because they both are totally on this state of nature contract element,
Hmm.
but how it plays out in the hierarchy, right, um, is different.
Yeah.
No checks and balances for the Leviathan, but Locke is checks and balances, limited government, you know. Um, so no, it's been a good run.
Yeah.
So good. We'll stop there.
Yep.